Hey everyone, I'm Steve from gamersnexus.net, and this is Corsair's brand new 600C case. This is a $150 case, and it's got some interesting points about it, like the inverted ATX design, which we'll get to in a moment. This case comes in two variants. There's the 600C, which has this window that's probably reflecting me right now on the camera, and then there's the 600Q, and the 600Q is sort of effectively quiet. That's at least what I translate the Q to mean. And it has no side panel window. It instead replaces that space with some sound damping or absorbing foam. And that's the Q version. Both of them are priced at $150, and they both have the same chassis and frame, of course. So let's dive into this thing. First of all, it comes with 3 fans, all 140 millimeters, 2 in the front, 1 in the back. These are intake, that's exhaust. And then it's also got space for a 240 or 280 millimeter in the front if you want to put that alongside those fans or replace those fans with that. The back, you can do a 140 millimeter radiator. It does support those. And then the ATX design is reversed. So normally with an ATX form factor case, you obviously, first of all, this is the right side of the case if you haven't noticed that. So first of all, this is on the wrong side. And normally it's obviously on the left side, as you all know. When you install the board, the system in the left side, the GPU is sort of halfway down, CPU is up at the top, or we call it the north of the board, and then power supply these days is often on the bottom, though that was once different. So Corsair has gone back many years in time, and they've put the power supply at the top, but they've at least updated it to a point that it makes more sense than it used to. In this instance, Corsair has taken a page from NZXT's book with the H440, and they've put a PSU shroud in there. So there's a big shroud covering the power supply, covering where the cables go, and actually covering the hard drive bays as well. So that's the next point that we're gonna look at here. The drive bays are all on the back side, and the power supply, the cabling is all on the back side. So this is a compartmentalized approach to system building, which improves ease of installation in general, especially in my experience with all of these cases that do this really. And the drives are located, 3 of them, on the rear of the motherboard tray. So those are for 2.5-inch SSDs. And then you've got your standard 3.5-inch drive bays up toward the front of the case under the front panel input devices. So the main thing here is the focus on the inverted layout. This is very similar in some ways to the Raven RV02, the Silverstone case that we reviewed some time ago, a couple years ago. And at the time, it was the best performing case we'd ever reviewed in terms of thermals. Now that case did something a little bit different. It still inverted the board a bit, rotated it this way, and the intake was all on the bottom in the RV02. So you had 3 intake fans. I think they were 180 millimeter off the top of my head. They pushed the air up and out through a single fan and through the power supply area where this is installed right now. That is the stack effect for cooling. That's what it's called. It's called the stack effect. And that basically just takes all your air, channels it in the bottom, forces it out a tiny hole in the top. So like a smokestack. That was very high performing, especially for GPUs, because you're funneling all of this air straight through that sort of grilled intake on the average reference design GPU. It's rotated a different way, the intake's in a different spot, but it does remind me a lot of that case for its performance. And the reason it reminds me of it is because you have your 2 intake fans here. They pull the air in, and the air stream splits. So we have the power supply fan pulling in up here. That is the only fan at the top. There's a GPU fan about this height. Then you have your CPU cooler fan here, which pulls most of the air in and out through the back to cool the CPU, of course. The GPU, it does have a blower fan in there with the reference design, so that's pulling air in, and the power supply is pulling air up and toward it as well. So your air channel is actually very efficient. And as we see in the benchmarks that I'll throw up here in a second, the performance impact is definitely noticeable. The one thing to look out for is passively cooled power supplies. So I would definitely opt for an actively cooled power supply in a case like this. Even if it spins down during idle times, you do want it to spin up under load to make sure that GPU is getting as much air as it can possibly siphon away from the CPU cooler, especially if you're using a tower cooler on there, because those are pretty aggressive on their fan RPMs. With the radiator support, one thing to note here that's pretty important. If you opt to install a radiator in the front, you will be forcing heat into your case. That's how it works. So with the radiator, if you push the heat into the case, it's not normally too bad depending on how hot it is and what CPU you're cooling. If it's an FX 9590, your problems are a lot amplified versus cooler TDP CPU. So when you're forcing the hot air in, it's not going to impact CPU temperature too much because that's basically an isolated unit under the CPU block, under the cold plate, but it will impact the GPU temperature, so I would watch out for that. Let's jump into the benchmarks and look at how this thing actually performs in terms of numbers and metrics and all of that stuff. We have 8 total charts. 4 of them are thermals at equilibrium and 4 are thermals over time. You can see them all in the written review linked in the description below, which may contain additional information not discussed here. The methodology is also in that review if you want to know how we tested it and see if you can replicate our results. Corsair 600C enclosure stands supreme for its GPU cooling ability, dominating our charts, and this is especially noticeable with multi-card configurations, as you'll see in a moment. With a single video card, the 600C leads the competition with a staggeringly low 2.44 Celsius idle delta T over ambient, and that was on our reference GTX 980, which is a relatively warm card already, and that beats out the other 3 cases on the bench. Using the 600C's high fan speed setting to push the full 12 volts to the fans, the GPU operates at 53.44 Celsius delta T over ambient, of about 21 Celsius or so ambient, and low falls slightly behind at 54.39 Celsius. So you have about a 1 degree difference between low and high, which is a good thing if you want to run the lower RPMs for noise reasons. Rosewell's B2 Spirit, which was previously our best of bench enclosure for its chart-topping thermal performance, has been knocked into second place at 55.33 Celsius with GPU benchmarks, and the delta between the 600C and the B2 Spirit is about 3.5%, so it's not huge, but definitely enough to be measured and not anywhere close to margin of error. The B2 Spirit is on this chart, but I want to emphasize that it's probably not the most linear comparison because it's about the same price, maybe 20 bucks more depending on when you buy it, but it's massive. It's more of a server-sized case, and that means the people who are looking at this thing might not be looking at the B2 Spirit, but I included it because it's a very strong thermal performer, and I wanted to see how a larger case compares to something like this that's optimized for airflow, but smaller. Looking against a more reasonable case, something that someone would more likely be considering a purchase of, the H440 V2, which is the new version of the H440, runs considerably warmer at 59.28 Celsius, and this is the cooler version of the H440 and Noctis 450, which is actually a good deal warmer than the H440 V2. The delta is 10.4% here, so that's definitely a gap that's becoming noticeable, particularly with warmer GPUs. And looking down to the bottom of the chart, we see Antec's P380. That's a case we weren't too fond of at its first unveil at CES, and it ranks the warmest on the chart. Throwing a card in for PhysX processing, this is something that partially blocks the primary GPU's blower fan, and we see thermals rise about 10 Celsius on the Corsair case. The B2 Spirit still stands just barely behind, but gains a noticeable 2 Celsius in idle temps over the Corsair 600C, and the delta between the H440 V2 and 600C shrinks to 8.2% with multi-GPU setups, so it's actually better than it was previously, but the GPU diode on our primary 980 is now sitting at about 90 Celsius, so that gap might actually be wider based on our data because the GTX 980 started throttling its frequency and voltage to keep the temperatures down. So NVIDIA's card was actively throttling itself to keep those temperatures at or below 90. And that's where you might see a temperature rise if you're using a warmer card, like maybe an AMD card. This is certainly very impressive GPU performance on Corsair's new case. I'll throw the thermal over time GPU charts up here momentarily if you want to see what those look like, but the average data is the same once it hits equilibrium. Moving to the test methodology briefly, as you look at these, what this shows is our custom in-house scripted benchmark. So this is an automated test. It is fully automated down to the second, which means that we can perfectly execute the beginning of the load test and the beginning of the idle test every single time. And that's why you see these bars all lining up effectively identically on the chart. Moving on to CPUs, the B2 Spirit thoroughly trounces all competition on the chart, landing at 40.57 Celsius load and 14.74 Celsius idle. So the 600C is in second place with its high setting and third with the low setting, both of which outpace the H440 V2 and the P380. The 600C is sitting at about 47 Celsius under load, and there's roughly a 1 Celsius gap between the high and low settings, which seems pretty acceptable for users who want to reduce fan noise at the cost of a degree of temperature rise. It's really not a big deal. So again, it's worth noting that the B2 Spirit is a massive case and forces a ton of air through its 4 fans, so it isn't necessarily a linear comparison here. It's a bit louder too, subjectively, but if you're looking at 2 high-performing cases, that's about what they look like, the 600C and the B2 Spirit. With 2 GPUs, performance is very similar, even marginally better in some instances, though it becomes a blurry line whether that's margin of error, which we have about 1% of, or if the second GPU's fans are actually changing the air dynamic enough to improve or decrease GPU and CPU cooling performance based upon the air dynamics and air channeling of the case. So a few things wrapping up here. We don't currently do objective noise and decibel level benchmarks, which I'd love to do, but I've said it many times now in the comments. We don't do them because noise, audio, it's very hard to do correctly. You have to have a perfect environment. You have to control AC, and noise outside could influence it. We don't have the equipment or the environment to test noise confidently right now, and if we can't test it accurately, I don't test it at all. I can tell you that subjectively, with the fan speeds on low, this is about where most other kind of silent cases sit, like the H440. It is a bit loud with the fan speeds on high, but if you've got it on the floor, you're not going to notice too much. If it's up sitting on your desk, more next to your head at that height or something like that, then it will be more noticeable. But that's all very subjective and probably not super useful. So I will leave the objective audio and dB level testing to folks who have the equipment to do so. Let's talk about the stuff I do have available though, and that's thermals and design and overall ease of installation with the 600C. Starting with ease of installation, pretty easy to install. The standoffs are all pre-installed, which I'm a big fan of, by the way. But the one thing I think Corsair could improve on, or actually a couple things on the same point here, would be some sort of cutout in the PSU shroud for the PCIe cables to the GPUs. This is something that NZXT does, and I'm in love with it on the S340, because you can route the cable straight up through the shroud and into the GPU, and one, it looks a lot better. Two, if you've got more restrictive cabling setups, like surprisingly with the Enermax 1300 watt PSUs, they have shorter cables, then it will aid in both of those instances, but really it's mostly just a thing with aesthetics. It looks better. If Corsair can line it up so that you can route a cable straight down through the shroud and into the PCIe slots on the GPU, I would be very happy with that change to the cable management. Now, you can, to their credit, route it through the hard drive cages, but you've got to either remove them or sit there and fidget with it for a few minutes, and it won't line up as perfectly because it's coming down way in the front of the case, and I want it moved back a little bit so that it lines up better with the GPUs. Other than this, maybe a cutout just sort of in this angled bevel thing going on right there, that would probably help, but something in that range would be very good for cable management. The next thing, 2 build quality things here. Pushing on this panel, it's pretty flexible. It's a little bit bendy there. I don't know if you can hear that on the audio, but picking the case up and moving it around, you will feel that flex a little bit. So it probably could be a bit sturdier, but how often are you really going to be sitting there doing this while you're playing games? So it's really not something I can knock them too hard for, because overall you get a large panel, clear panel, and you're not really going to get that without affording some of your resilience in terms of structural integrity, because you have this huge piece of plexiglass or whatever it is so that you can see into the case, so you're sacrificing all this steel that would normally surround it. So I can give them a pass on that. The next thing I would comment on in terms of build quality is the power supply mounting. So there is a small bracket on the back of this. It's a steel bracket, and you screw that in to the power supply, just like the NZXT cases, and I think maybe the Fantex cases do it too at this point. But there is, it's not thick enough at the top and the bottom, so the lip that you get that goes over the power supply and slots into the case can bend very easily, and that can happen just trying to install the power supply if you don't line it up 100% perfectly, which it is pretty foolproof, and you should be able to line up a power supply perfectly because it's a rectangle hole in a rectangle box. But as we found out, if it's not 100% perfect, then that steel will bend with the slightest bit of force because it's not very strong. So you have to sit there and kind of hammer it back into place, which is doable and you can get it working. But that is a point of quality I think Corsair could potentially look at in the future. Other than that, I do pretty much like everything in the case. The thumb screws could maybe be torqued a little bit less. I think they're plagued by the same NZXT problem where the thumb screws are not actually toolless. They require tools because they're torqued too tight. But it's a good case at the end of the day, and this is something I would recommend at the $150 price point. Overall, despite these small things I just listed off, very high build quality. Those are kind of nitpicks. The cooling performance is superior to everything else we've currently tested other than the B2 Spirit with its CPU cooling, and that's a much larger case at potentially a different market. So the Corsair 600C, the one with the window, is a case that I would say is worth looking at for the enthusiast. $150 price point on a case. Your next options to look at if this does not interest you for some reason, or if you just want to do research on your options, which is always good, would be the H440. There's a new V2 that is either shipping now or will be shipping soon. That's a bit improved over the H440 V1. There's another NZXT case, the Nexus 450, if you want something more gamer aesthetic looking than this or the H440. And if you look outside of NZXT and Corsair, there's a P380, which is Antec's case. I'm not a huge fan of it, but it does have a sort of neat aluminum thing going on. Inwin now has some cheaper cases at this price range, which is new for them. That's worth looking at too. And the Rosewell B2 Spirit, if you want something sort of massive. Aside from these, the next one would be the Silent Bass 800 from Be Quiet, which we tested and liked pretty well. It's very quiet, as the name would hopefully indicate, and it performs pretty well. So that would be the range of cases I would look at if I were buying on the 150-ish price point, plus or minus 30. And that's all for this one. If you like this content, hit the Patreon link in the post-roll video. The review is fully written and on the website if you want more depth, you want to see those charts longer. Thank you for watching. I will see you all next time.